Hi everyone, it's Rachel again with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you a video recommending cold weather science fiction and fantasy. Every year I like to do a video talking about my favorite horror and thriller books that are set in the winter, and I want to do the same thing for SFF. However, I did find it a little bit trickier. I will admit this is my first time doing the video, and you're going to see a couple of obvious ones on here, but I definitely would like to work to make this an annual event, so if you enjoy this, let me know with a thumbs up, and if you enjoy this kind of content, stick around and subscribe. Otherwise, let's get started. First, let's start by talking about fantasy, which I'll admit was way easier to come up with recommendations for. I definitely prefer science fiction, but I think just a lot of books that are set in space, while space is really cold, just doesn't quite have the wintry feels that I'm looking for. So anyway, the first one I want to talk about is really obvious, and that is A Game of Thrones, the first book in the Song of Ice and Fire series by George R. R. Martin. And I think everyone knows the line, winter is coming, but I gotta say that this series does it right when it comes to winter. As I mentioned in many videos, I'm Canadian myself, and so winter and cold weather and snowstorms are all part of my life. And so because of that, I'm very picky or particular or judgmental when books talk about winter, and some of them just don't seem to understand how cold the cold actually is. Except for in this book. In this series in general, I find that the parts that are set in the north, the author just really seems to understand how incredibly cold it is and how it affects them. There's a lot of talk about survival, and just the atmosphere is so well done. Obviously, these stories take place in different parts of Westeros, so you do have the warmer climates as well, but the winter chapters up north are so cold, and of course in the later books you have winter creeping in, and so it starts to get colder and colder even down south, and I just think it is the perfect way to kick off a winter season. And obviously if you haven't read these books, I do recommend it. Will they ever get finished? Probably not. Next is The Wolf in the Whale by Jordana Max Brodsky, and this one I like to think it's a little bit more underhyped. This is a fantasy story that is set in the past, and it involves a romance or connection between a Viking and an Inuit tribe. Within the story, we follow a young person who is biologically seen as being female. However, they do not necessarily identify that way themselves and have always just enjoyed the benefits of going out and hunting and be one of the boys. However, as this person comes of age and womanly things start to happen with their body, they're told that they can no longer hunt. They do not really agree with this and really see themselves as being of both genders, which is known as two-spirited within different indigenous groups. And so we have that representation on the page, and so they fight against the stereotypes and fight to actually have a place to continue hunting. This book is classified as fantasy, but I'll be honest, those elements are very light. There's a little bit of touch of magic throughout the story, but it's mostly about this young person, and their identity plays a large role within the story. And there's also a heavy romance, which, if you know my taste in books, isn't my personal favorite thing, but at the same time this story is set in the cold areas up north, and so I think if you're looking for something that's just chilling and has that good atmosphere and setting, this is one you may want to check out, especially if you love romance a little bit more than I do. Next we have Clan of the Cave Bear by Jean M. Aroulier, and this is the first book in a 6-book series, but personally I recommend stopping after the first 3 because the last 3 are not very good. This is a book that is set in prehistoric times, so during the Ice Ages, and we follow a young woman who right at the beginning of the story something happens, she is left alone and will presumably die. However, a group of Neanderthals find her and bring her into their group. You find out that she is not of the same background or has a different lineage, and so she is actually the prehistoric people that will become humans of the modern day. I can't remember the names, I'm filming this, so bear with me. But essentially she's brought into this other group. She is very much seen as an other because her features and face are quite different, because again it's starting to evolve to more traditional human features. And despite that, she finds her place within the group, and there is a romance plot within this one. This romance I actually don't mind as much. It definitely gets heavier in the romance in the later books, just to warn you. But what I really like about this book is the cultural elements to the story. Obviously the author, given the age or time period that this book is set, had to make some guesses, but my understanding is that she made really educated guesses. She did as much research as possible and actually brought in as much historical evidence into her story as she could. And so I found the world building within this to be fantastic. And in terms of fantasy, like the other one I just mentioned, this one is very light. There is a hint of mysticism, but you kind of always wonder as a reader whether or not there's actually anything magical happening, or if it's simply just the characters not understanding the scientific nature of the world, and so seeing magic where they just don't simply understand. So I really like this book. Again, very light in the fantasy, but it's definitely a colder story set in the Ice Age, although it does go through different periods of time, but there's certainly moments that deal with the snow and the cold and all of that. So I definitely recommend this one as a great winter read. I think I read it for the first time over Christmas, so that was just a perfect experience. And next is another really obvious one, but I had to mention, and that is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. This is actually the second book in the Narnia series, but I know most people start here because I believe the first book is almost more of a prequel to the series. And so within the story, we follow a group of siblings that go off to the countryside to escape the war and the bombings, and they go off, and within the house that they are staying there is this wardrobe that leads them into another world. So there's a piece of portal fantasy. This, I should mention, is children's literature. Almost always I'm reading adult literature, but this one is such a classic that I did want to check it out. I actually read it for the first time as an adult, and I will admit that you can definitely tell this is meant for younger readers. It's very simple in nature, it's very short, but it does relatively hold up. I think the biggest challenge that has made this book less popular today is the fact that it has some really heavy religious allegory within it. And I mean really heavy. So if you grew up Catholic or otherwise, you're going to see a lot of those references within the story. It's very like smack you on the head with religious, biblical, Christian text. But if you're someone who perhaps does not enjoy those aspects of the story, that might be a no-go for you. But as you probably know, Narnia is in winter at the time of this book, and there's actually even a cameo of a certain man in red, if you know what I mean. And so this book is perfect to read in the winter, especially if you can manage to do it around Christmas time. If you have young people in the house, this one is age appropriate for those younger readers. And overall, I thought it was pretty cute. At the time of recording this is the only book in the series I have read, so I'd love to know if you think I should continue on and read the rest of the series. Do they hold up as adults if you never read them as a child and you don't have that nostalgia going for you? Then we have The Winter of Ice and Iron by Rachel Neumeyer, and this is a piece of epic fantasy that follows a princess and a duke that are forced to team up together to try to save their land. This is a piece of adult fantasy, and I did enjoy this one for the most part. I like the elements to it. It has great world building. As you can guess from the title, it is set in a wintry climate, so the weather definitely plays a role within the story. The characters are likable. They have a familiar plot and tropes throughout the story, and so I like this one. It's not an all-time favorite fantasy series of mine. I don't think it's the most memorable, but again, if you're looking for something set in the winter, this is one you might be tempted to check out yourself. And finally, for fantasy, I want to talk about The Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne, and this is the first book in a trilogy that is a piece of Viking-inspired epic fantasy for adults. And within the story, we follow a few different perspectives, but my favorite is definitely the perspective of Orca, who is the mother. Right at the beginning of the story, something happens to her son, and she goes off on a mission to find him. And this causes her to revisit and come back to her days of fighting, and she is fierce and strong, and it's just a really powerful female character. There's also some other perspectives that are equally amusing, well fleshed out, and really help to round out the story. And again, this is just the first book. This one is not per se winter horror as much as it's just set in the Viking North. And so it just has those cold weather feelings. The atmosphere and the setting definitely play a role within the story. And I think that you get more of that even in the second book, and you kind of get to see that fleshed out. But while this one isn't strictly Santa Claus, there's no Christmas or anything like that, this one definitely does have those cold weather elements. So for a lot of people, I do have to remember that winter doesn't even necessarily equal snow. You don't necessarily need to have a blizzard happening to make something a winter book. And so I think if you just want really cold vibes within a fantasy story that is really good, this is one you may want to check out. Now, switching gears to science fiction, let's start with the really obvious one, and that is The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. And this is a story of a human emissary that is sent off to a planet to go and study the people or aliens there. And within this world, we find a planet where they have different ideas around gender and sexuality. This book, for the age it's written, was incredibly progressive in the ideas that the author was bringing forward, and just really shaking up the idea of social norms and that people are just a certain way. It was really revolutionary for its time. I feel like it's still revolutionary for its time. But if you don't know, this book is also set on a cold, wintry planet. So unlike a lot of science fiction, this one has a definite sense of winter. It has snow. And while it's technically in the backdrop of the story, I do feel like it's prevalent enough to really make an impact on it. So if you haven't read this iconic book by this beloved science fiction author, I definitely recommend you change that. Next, we have The Ice Lion by Kathleen O'Neill Gear, and this is a piece of science fiction that's very light on the science elements. Basically, it is set in a future where there is another ice age and humanity has regressed, so the story, while it's set in the future, technically reads more like a story being set in the ice ages of past. We follow a group of characters through their adventures, and for me, I'll admit I didn't fully love this one. I'm recommending it because it has that ice age setting, but in terms of science fiction, it was really hard to spot those elements. I love regressed societies in books, but I need to see those elements because otherwise I don't actually know that I'm reading science fiction. And within the story, I just found that the plot was a little bit too fast. The narrative just flies a mile a minute, and because of that, I never really got attached to the characters. I didn't feel like they're the most fleshed out. So I'll be honest, this is one I don't personally recommend, but it kind of belongs on this list because of its atmosphere and setting. Also for science fiction, we have Permafrost by Alistair Reynolds. This is a sci-fi novella that follows a group of researchers out in the Arctic. The story also involves time travel. It's very short, so I want to leave it there. This is one that I liked, but I don't think it's his best work. I do think he works better in the longer form, simply just because I really like his world building, which doesn't get as fleshed out in a short novella. But if you're looking for something, of course, set in the Arctic that involves time travel, this is the book you might want to read. And finally, I want to talk about Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie. This is a piece of science fiction. It's the first book in a trilogy, and at least this first book does have a wintry aspect. Within the story, it's told over a few different timelines, and so we follow this artificial intelligence in the present day that is going down to this ice planet, and they're there on a mission. You find out that there is a revenge plot that is happening within the story. They are there to find someone, and this planet is very cold. So the story starts out right in the middle of this. She has to deal with like sledding and snow and all of that. So if you're looking for those wintry elements, it's right in the forefront of the story, at least at the beginning. This book, I'll be honest, is incredibly hard to summarize on camera, but basically on top of the present day plot, there is also a past where this individual that is now in one body used to be an ancillary that was the artificial intelligence for an entire ship, and not just the ship, but also had the ability to control different physical bodies as well. This story just deals with so many thematic topics. It's unsettling and creepy, and very much deals with the idea of taking over another place and just being the aggressors. It has some great social commentary on oppression, and basically the story is written from the perspective of those that are doing the oppressing, and the artificial intelligence is working for them. And so we have this very interesting skewed perspective that you don't always see. The story is nuanced. It does some really interesting things with gender because the main character uses the same she and her pronouns for everyone regardless of their biological parts. And overall, I just think the story is really smart. It's fierce. It's different. It's such a unique one. It's not for beginners, but I really love it. I think it's a great one, and I do hope you check it out if you never did read it before. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And I would also love to hear what is one of your favorite books that is set in the winter when it comes to science fiction or fantasy, because again, I would love to do this video as an annual event, but in order to do that, I gotta do a lot more reading. I feel like I picked off a lot of the really obvious ones this year, like Narnia and A Game of Thrones. So if I want to do it again, I've got to be a lot more creative next year. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're new to my channel, I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, and fantasy. If you want to help me out more, you can give me a comment, even if it's just a little emoji like a snowflake, that all helps me out. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. And don't forget, if you want to hear about more wintry recommendations, I have a ton of videos talking about horror and thriller books that are set in the winter, so I'm going to have those linked down below. Otherwise, I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.